Hey everybody. So I wanted to compile all 5 parts of the story into one video for you, similar to what I did for Something is Pretending to Be My Friend. I actually intend on redoing this narration in its entirety, but until then, I wanted to get this compiled video for you guys. So you may notice some differences between the parts because the first part was recorded about 4 months ago when I first started narrating, and the last part was recorded about 2 weeks ago. So yeah, you'll probably notice some differences in between the parts, but I hope you guys enjoy.
Entry, August 16th, Tuesday, 2016. M. Collis. I'm writing this from a motel in Redstone, Colorado. I've been in the same room for the past 3 days and only left to get snacks and bottled water. There haven't been any warnings on the TV yet, but I'm waiting. Will there even be warnings this time? Back in Glenwood Springs, where I'm from, it started with the warning. The emergency alert system. You know the sound. The sudden silence, then the successive beeps followed by that flatline tone. When I heard the beeping and screeching, I assumed it wasn't anything to worry about. At most, a weather advisory. But how do you react when this comes up?
Emergency alert system. Ed authorities. Issued an emergency action notification 1 mile distance from intersection I-70 and Route 82. Estimated time, 3 minutes preparation. Locate closest relations. Grasp hands and sit where you are. Close your eyes and do not speak. Do not speak. Do not open your eyes. Ignore all sounds. Do not react to touch. Failure to follow cautionary measures will result in detection. Warning will be lifted at the sound of 4 short beeps, followed by 1 extended.
I want you to see this before going into the rest, because if you do see it, and I hope you never do, then know that all you can do is take care of yourself. You'll want to help your parents or siblings or partners, but you can't. Please let me share this with you. As crazy as it might sound, it might help you. I lived with my mom in a small ranch house that sat close to the road just outside of town on Highway 6. The sun had just gone down and the sky still had errant remnants of fading colors. The sliding door leading to the small backyard was open, and there was barely a breeze coming through. It had been a beautiful night, disturbed only by heavy and sporadic traffic. I didn't pay a lot of attention to it at the time, but it sounded like semis were making their way into town and then back out again. Mom was in the kitchen, waiting for the water to boil for tea as she went through her cell phone, which was charging in a nearby outlet. Lynn, my best friend, had stepped into the bathroom and I was relaxed on the couch watching something. It happened right then. A sound from the distance, so potent and full of force, it started as a rumble in my chest before I even heard it. The vibrations rolled through me, and before I could react, I heard the sound of blasting in the distance. It was like a sub-audible rumble, followed by a muffled explosion, ending in what sounded like the last bits of water going down a recently unclogged drain. I froze and looked back at my mom. "I heard it too," she said, wide-eyed. The steam was just beginning to shoot from the kettle spout. I heard the bathroom door shut, and Lynn came back out, stopping at the couch. "Did you hear that?" Her hand was resting on her chest. "Yeah, and I felt it." I look at the opening sliding door. "What do you think?" My phone went off. My mom's phone went off. The kettle reached its piercing shriek, and she removed it from the stove. The TV went blank and began to buzz loudly. We read the message. I looked to my mom. I looked to my friend, my mom. I saw their mouths forming the words. Grasp hands. Do not speak. The wind picked up, and night air spilled into the house. The smell was intermingled with ozone and decay. My mom went to the door and closed it. The lights went out. I saw a dark shape charging past the house out of town and strange blue and green lights emanating from their eyes. Lynn screamed but covered her mouth instantly. My stomach dropped 3 inches into my hips. Despite all of this, it was eerily quiet outside. Aside from the wind pounding against the house, there were no screams. No frantic tires peeling down driveways. When Lynn grabbed my hand, I almost jumped. My mom sat next to me, and the three of us eased onto the couch in the dark. Lynn whispered into the inky black, "Is this for real? It's some sort of bizarre test or practical joke?" I felt their hands in mine and knew that on some level, we realized it wasn't a joke. The wind continued, but through it I heard something else. It was the sound of a crowd talking, but it sounded like they were all speaking in whispers. I had this feeling of being far from them, but that I was drawing closer every second, because the cacophony of voices became larger, but no more intelligible. "I think we should do like the warning said, at least until we hear that all is clear," I said to both of them. They both agreed in small voices, and I could only assume that they were closing their eyes like I had. I have no idea how long we sat there. The sound of voices grew, but dissipated slightly as if scattered by the gusts outside. Still, I heard no human voices outside, no boots pounding on the road, or the sound of engines. Then a few things happened almost at once. I felt a few puffs of cold air come in from the left and then right, moving across my face and tossing my hair. Whispers were carried on them, but I only caught snippets. "Where is she? That nasty fucker, he's next." Some crying and sniffling. It sounded like it was coming from a child. Time. More time. My mom's hand clenched in mine. It was dry, but in the way she held it, it felt different. Fingers moved, one by one in succession. The thumb rubbing the top of my hand. It felt so familiar, and I thought I can admit now that I realized right then why I remembered that touch. I couldn't be in the moment. I heard the sharp intake of breath, followed by a slow, rattling exhale. It made my blood run with ice. It sounded final. Mom's voice came out dry, papery, and tired. I've missed you, but you've got to get out of here, Bob. They're frenzied and craving life again. It's a thirst you can't imagine. This was said urgently, sadly. "Please, sweetie, get in the car and go." It sounded so strained, so worried. My mind was racing, and Lynn's hand was beyond sweaty. She had heard it too, knew the voice, and I knew I trusted it. But the warning. As I was trying to think of where the car keys were, Lynn's hands clenched in mine, painfully hard. She convulsed on the couch and cried out. I couldn't help myself. I looked over at her. When I opened my eyes, I found her face 4 inches from mine, with her eyes closed, breathing heavily through her nose. "Lynn?" I asked in a whisper. "You nasty bitch." "It should have been you. Lynn's voice was hard and cruel. She wrenched my arm towards her, and my fingers slipped from my mom's hand. I won't detail the grappling fight we had, partially because the events of that night were so sudden and confusing I hardly remember specifics. I left her writhing on the floor, yelling incoherently, and ran to the kitchen, grabbing the keys off the rack, and felt my way to the garage door in the darkness. The scratches she gave me hurt, but the tears had fallen from my eyes, so the already dark and confusing world I saw was at least clear, not blurry. I had no idea what the hell was happening, and knew that I was in danger merely by moving, breathing heavily and loudly, and for having my eyes open. Mom's car rolled onto the street and I went south down 6. The town was dark. The shops were all deserted, but maybe people were just sitting and holding hands, eyes closed, waiting. I saw a few people walking slowly in the streets. A few were running, taking clunky, uncoordinated steps. They looked confused, and some looked angry. As I approached the edge of town, I saw a blockade with a small opening on the middle of the road. Men and women in black uniforms and glowing blue-green eyes watched me as I approached. They began to converge on the gap, with strange brass-looking tools in their hands. I began crying as I sped up and surged through them. A few screamed as I clipped them with my car. They watched me leave with their strange eyes. What good is a blockade if they let people through? Did I do something, or not do something, that put them at ease as I drove? Were there others, and where did they go? Why were their eyes glowing? I couldn't shake that they felt like military, but most important of all, what the hell had I experienced? The speed with which these events took place left me dizzy, and it took me some time for my mind to settle. So I've been sitting in this motel room, now wondering all of this, and I think I'm starting to put it together. The first piece that came to me was the acceptance that the voice I heard and the touch I felt were my father's. I didn't want to believe that because he's been dead for 6 years now. A sudden stroke took him as he worked in the garage one morning. He's the only one who called me bub. I'm going to stop here because it's as far as I've gotten. I want to return, but I don't know what I'll find or even if I'll be allowed back. There's been nothing broadcasted on the news. I appreciate your comments, though. Update. I've been contacted by Ed, officially named Eldridge. He wants to speak with me about the events of that night. I meet with him tomorrow. Hopefully, I'll get some answers to all this. Stay posted. I appreciate all of your responses. I was told by Eldridge that my mom didn't make it through the event. He said,
"The town is lost."
but he didn't elaborate. I want to believe she's alive, and that Lynn's alive too, but after what he told me, I don't know what to think. But if I'm being honest with you, I think I know the truth of it. And I'm reeling from this news in the worst way. But this forum and writing everything down seemed to calm my mind enough for me to have some feelings of normalcy, so here I am. And I appreciate all of your thoughts and kind words. One user asked me why I left my mom there, taking the only car we had. I would like to say I knew right then that she was gone, but that would be a lie. I was scared. Scared of the rattling breath she took, the words my father spoke, and the sudden change in Lynn. It was all too much, so I ran. I'm not proud of that, but there it is. Entry, August 18th, Thursday, 2016. M. Collis. I did as some suggested, and met Eldridge in a public place. He was aggressively ordinary in appearance, somewhere between 35 and 45. His eyes and his demeanor conveyed a kind but sterile personality. Below is what he told me. He gave me clearance to write this down and pass it on. He said he wants it to get out in the open, even if it's in the smallest of ways, one random subreddit out of 1,000.
Higher-ups aren't reacting how they should be to this, so maybe this will subvert their orders to remain tight-lipped.
His words. We met at a local coffee shop. Amidst the normal sounds and conversation, we took a seat in the back. I stirred my black coffee as he talked.
The EDD referred to in the emergency message is called the Extreminal Defense Department. It was started in the late 1930s when rumors of Nazi experiments into the paranormal began circulating. Although it was said to have stopped in the early 40s after the Philadelphia experiment,
Google it. I had to.
operations continued.
He was brief with me on the details, and he glazed over a lot of it.
But the turning point for the EDD was when a breakthrough was made in relation to the afterlife, or more accurately, a liminal phase, as they call it.
Don't ask, because I don't know, and he didn't say.
But they determined that, to some extent, humans can exist beyond death. It's not life after death.
He was adamant about that.
They found that there is a plane of existence, or a way of being after death.
It has something to do with emotions. Eldridge explained it like this.
Individuals create patterns in their brains throughout life relating to events, situations, or circumstances, and these are linked inextricably to emotions. These create what you can think of as ruts in the road or a well-worn path related to a thought pattern. People carve these ruts deep as time passes. In many cases, the patterns are negative in nature, though in some cases they're positive. In general, it's negative thinking patterns. Individuals that pass on with deep ruts associated with one emotion or few often feel these emotions more strongly than others. These emotions are somehow the catalyst for perpetuation beyond physical existence. There's a desire to keep those ruts deep and fresh.
I thought of old ghost stories, where people die angry or in deep sorrow, and their spirits linger forever. I told him this, and he said it's very much along those lines, although much more complex and less Stephen King.
It's an inability to let go in some ways. We can't explain it too in depth, but the science that's been worked out is beyond me and definitely beyond you.
He explained, with no condescendence in his voice.
Cut to 1995. Facilities have been built across the United States. 5 of them: Colorado, South Texas, West Virginia, Maine, and Arizona. These facilities contain the culmination of the R&D done for the EDD, both privately and government funded. Each facility has its own liminal gateway equipment designed to generate a space to bring these manifestations into being. They're called shadows to those in the know, apparently. The catch is that enormous amounts of energy needs to be fed into the shadows to make them corporeal. These tends to result in a gross amplification of the shadow's personality and their emotional state. All 5 facilities operate simultaneously, or not at all. Despite the geographic distance, they share some sort of lie lines that power the devices with enough energy to complete the shadow infusion process. All are set to operate by specific key players in the EDD. The problem is that if less than 5 are used at once, more power is fed into the active devices by default of the lie lines, which can have potentially devastating consequences. Colorado's site was the only one running the night on August 16th.
The fucked up thing. Oh, pardon me.
No, you're right. It's all fucked.
He smiled.
Yes, well, a problem we didn't foresee was the ability of a shadow to escape the liminal containment field.
I was lost with this comment, but he muttered something about the infusion plates operating at unregulated rates, and a crack in the containment lid. In 2013, he explained,
The woman in question immediately became violent, her behavior erratic. She injured a few others on the floor before being subdued, and the machine's sequence shut down across the country. Her original personality never returned, and for the past 3 years she's been held in a secure EDD facility. The behavior ebbs and flows, but she won't answer to her own name anymore, and has accurately provided details into a life she should know nothing about. This has since been dubbed supplantation, or supplanting. It's as scary as it sounds. Not necessarily a body snatcher, but a body switcher. The person whose body it is has nowhere to go after being supplanted. So they push you out of your body and take over. EDD scientists don't know where you go or what happens to you after being supplanted. So far, there have been 11 supplantation incidents across EDD facilities.
and these people are not themselves anymore? I thought of the words spoken to me that night. I've missed you. I've missed you. You've got to get out of here, Bob. I've missed you. That wasn't my mother. Not anymore, at least. Did that mean... Eldridge tore at the cardboard of his now empty coffee cup.
No, not anymore. The ones who are still alive, that is to say, are not who they used to be. 3 out of those 11 killed themselves.
Why? It was all I could ask.
We suspect that the intruding manifestation couldn't cope with its new body, its new state of existence, but we really don't know for sure.
He glanced at his watch, and then out the window into the sunlight.
I have to leave soon. I wanted to meet for 2 reasons. The first I already covered. I wanted the history of this, at least some semblance of it, out there. What the government and the EDD are struggling with needs at least some light shed on it. We're playing with dangerous, volatile, and at best poorly understood forces. Forgive the hypocrisy of my current official station, but that doesn't sit well with me morally. The second and more official reason I'm here is because I need to know your experience. We found your mother in your house and the remains of what appeared to be a fight.
I sat back in my chair and took a deep breath. The events of that night had played over in my head a million times. And I knew he'd read my posting on it, otherwise we wouldn't be meeting. Still, I explained it to him. He listened silently, taking notes. He looked up when I explained about my father.
What was your father's name?
Charleston, but everyone called him Charlie. Never Charles, he hated that. I thought again of the touch of my mother's hand as my father spoke through her. Eldridge was silent for a moment. He clicked his pen and then shut his notebook.
Thank you, Miss Callis. I have to head back to town.
Glenwood, does that mean...
No, it doesn't.
I asked quickly, were there others? Others who got out? He turned to leave. His back to me. He shook his head.
No.
Wait. I got up and followed him. It feels like you've told me a lot, but barely anything worth...
That information is worth more than my life in some ways. Believe me.
Yes, well... Tears welled up in my eyes. My mother's gone, according to you. And that's probably true if I can trust what I feel in my heart. But my father seemed to speak to me, which seems impossible, since he died 6 years ago. And my home is apparently off limits. Yet no one outside of Glenwood seems to have any idea what happened. My voice had risen, and a couple close to us looked over uncomfortably. Eldridge glanced around hastily and led me outside. Car keys in hand, his voice dropped to a whisper.
The night of August 16th at approximately 1900 hours, the device outside of your town was engaged. The other 4 were dormant. We're determining how this happened, but it's somewhat hard given that the facility is largely destroyed. The conductors aren't meant to handle that much energy, with no containment field.
Containment field?
I must be going crazy showing you this.
He grabbed a napkin and drew this.
This is more or less what a piece of the device looks like. Those 5 structures,
he pointed them out,
are melted beyond recognition. We don't know how it was turned on, but this now puts the other 4 at risk.
So, this device is activated. It goes nuclear, essentially. Opens the door for the manifestation.
Manifestations, plural.
Manifestations to come through, and then
the door was shut and the key was melted. The EDD currently has operatives containing what they can, but we are looking at what I think can be ironically called a ghost town now. I say again, the town is lost.
His keys jingled and he shifted.
I have to go.
He handed me a business card.
If you remember anything else, contact me, and do not attempt to go back. Do you understand me?
I numbly took the card and nodded. He patted my arm awkwardly and left, and now I'm back in my small room. This is what I remember from the conversation. Do with it what you will. I want to mourn my mother, but there's this bizarre sense of hope with the knowledge that my father is somehow still around. It's masking those sorrowful feelings, for now at least. I'm going to go back. I can walk and camp my way there. I begin tonight. The last 4 days have culminated in nothing but empty takeout containers and confusion. There has to be something I can do, some way I can see my parents again. I will keep you all updated as best I can in the next few days. Thank you for your support and thoughts. Entry, August 20th, Saturday, 2016, M. Collis. The grief was nearer than I thought. I posted the last update and everything swept over me. It's hard to convey, but the sheer terror of knowing that this has happened, paired with the apparent death of my mother, overwhelmed me. The thought of going back to Glenwood was exciting, but that feeling disappeared quickly. I wanted to get out of Redstone. I needed to fill the space in my head with something other than worry and grief. I very roughly, pushed this down and covered it until it was a dull throb in the background of my mind. I was in motion. I thankfully had my mom's credit card as she had left her purse in the car, so I bought a single tent, backpack, change of clothes, a battery source for my laptop, and some other supplies. I finished prepping around 3 p.m. At 3:10, the power went out in Redstone. I checked outside my motel room door and saw quizzical faces appearing in the windows. Small clusters of people gathered outside, and there was a sense of general confusion and annoyance. Returning to my room, I took a shower quickly to savor what I could of the hot water, and eventually left town by foot around 4 p.m. The power outage was bizarre and ominous, and I half expected my phone to go off with that terrible emergency message, but nothing happened. The answer would be in Glenwood. It took me about 10.5 hours to get there, with some small breaks in between. Along the way, I saw roadblocks with heavy traffic being directed through the detours. The Ed must have set up some sort of quarantine in order to keep others out of Glenwood and residents in. I kept my distance and continued along. Foot traffic through the wilderness didn't seem to be a top concern for them. I admit that when I finally got there, what I found in the late hours of the night chilled me. As I approached, I felt a hum in my chest similar to the one I felt on August 16th. It wasn't followed by an explosion, but it grew as I got closer to town. Once I was close enough, I saw why. Spaced in intervals of about 120 feet apart were semi-sized truck flatbeds. On each one rested a tower, 4-sided and slightly triangular in shape. 40 feet high and topped with a globe that was ringed with a flat band around its circumference. Dozens of these flatbeds ringed the town. They went on as far as I could see, shrinking in the distance until I could cover them with my thumb. Countless cords, as thick as my thigh, ran from each. Suddenly, the power outage made sense. This much energy had to come from somewhere. Did the Ed release some false statement blaming a mechanical failure at the power plant? The humming was emanating from them in a fine haze, not unlike heat rising from a hot road, hung in the space between each tower. I couldn't help but gasp. It's a goddamn containment field. The implications of this were frightening. In the distance, I could hear yelling, laughter, crying. It all sounded off. The laughter slightly too hysterical, the yelling persistently furious and full of red anger, the crying of a mourner at the edge of a freshly dug grave. It was overwhelming. I suddenly didn't want to try to get in. The events of the past few days were so fresh, the pain so new, so I sat down and unpacked to busy my hands. With my tent set up, I went inside and zipped the flap shut. The humming in my chest remained. I set an alarm on my watch and dozed for a while. I slept fitfully, and when the alarm went off at 3 a.m., I was happy to be awake. Eating a granola bar, I contemplated turning around, but what was there to go back to? Grabbing my backpack, I zipped my tent shut behind me and took off. I could see personnel carrying those strange devices in the distance. As I walked, I thought over what Eldridge told me. My eyes had been closed when both my mom and Lynn were supplanted. The shadows felt like gusts of cold air, and I could still hear them. But could I have seen them? Maybe the strange eyes were some sort of defense against the supplantation. Ocular implants, though? Were these people keeping watch even human? These questions whirled like a dry wind in my mind, and before I knew it, I was within town limits. It was dark, so I wasn't terribly worried about being seen, but I crouched anyway. I made my way up the west side of the Roaring Fork River, and I would have to cross before it connected to the Colorado. Were weaving in and out of the tower-generated haze, untouched as they patrolled. I reasoned that I should be alright, too. There wasn't much activity, but the horrible noises continued, growing louder as I approached. I would have to go through some residential and shopping areas to get to the heart of town, and the thought scared me. I didn't have a weapon, and I didn't even know what kind I would need. Obviously, you're reading this, so I'm currently safe for the most part, but at the time my mind was moving from one awful scenario to the next. I never mentioned details of my fight with Lynn, and I don't intend to. I never mentioned details of my fight with Lynn, and I don't intend to. With the exception that she fought with a strength I didn't know she had. I was terrified to encounter that, not only for the potential of an altercation, but it would also alert people to my presence. Moving softly, I crept to the edge of the flatbed. I looked up, and the enormity of the device struck me. It was tall and alien. I skirted around to the right side of it, and saw the retreating back of a guard moving away to my left. I took off running and stopped under an awning of a small hardware shop. Passing through the haze and hum, I realized that I felt nothing. No resistance or pushback. Even stranger was the fact that once I passed through, the humming in my chest stopped. I kept close to the wall and rounded the corner. I was going to have to cross the Colorado and head way west to get to my house. It would take a while, but the shadows would help. The sounds continued in the background, but as I moved through the streets, I heard something else. A low, muffled moaning slid down the empty streets. I heard it coming from two different ends of the road I was on. I tried to ignore it, but I heard it again as I advanced. On the corner of 7th and Grand, I saw it. A cube made of what looked like plexiglass. 10 feet by 10 feet. Emanating from what appeared to be the plexiglass itself was a light blue hue. Inside were about 15 people crammed together. Their clothes were dirty and their skin had yellowish blue hue to it. Their eyes were sunken and afraid. Some looked angry but worn out. Others' eyes were just closed, heads leaning against the glass, almost dead. The moaning was coming from those inside. I recognized a face. Marshall Levy, an old high school classmate. We had gone on a date once, but a dramatic episode involving spilled soda on my pants and a serious lack of chemistry ensured it was our only date. He looked terrible, but his face seemed different. There was something in the way his lip was pulled up into a leer. There was dried spit and mucus around his mouth, caked and cracked. His eyes found mine, but there was no recognition there. I just realized I was a few feet from the glass now. Looking down at the road behind me, a loud thud made me jump. Marshall has pushed others aside and slammed himself against the wall. He was yelling inarticulately, scratching at the glass. My heart instantly began pounding, and I stood frozen, watching him in his frenzy. Voices, human voices, echoed in the distance, and I heard footsteps. Sparing a glance from Marshall, I ran across the street to the footbridge and sprinted away hard. When I reached the end, I had slowed to an out-of-breath walk. I had to follow 6 until I hit the outer edge of town to find my house, but I needed a break. From my position, slightly above the main road, I could now see the dull glow of blue spotted sporadically along the east, west, and south of town, and there were dozens of them. The people in those cubes, they were residents. All of them were residents. All of them looked gaunt and exhausted. Were they all supplanted? I couldn't even fathom a situation where literally no one had escaped, but then I remembered Eldridge and the small but firm shake of his head when I asked if others had gotten away. No. If that was the case, then it would mean that the Ed was rounding these people up, many of whom had probably been supplanted, but others who may have just been terrified and in hiding. It was sick, but Eldridge hadn't given any indication that a method was known to unsupplant. Is that even a word? Someone. Assuming the intruding manifestation could be pushed out, would the body die? Or all of these people simply lost causes? It was cruel and cold. Then a sudden thought struck me. My mom. Was her body dying in a cube somewhere? My father trapped inside? I connected with the main road and followed it to the street that crawled along the foothills of the mountains. Along the way, I saw more personnel in black, but also other individuals in gray and red uniforms carrying firearms, eyes glowing. At the time, I didn't know what to make of it, so I ignored them. I followed the road slowly, and it took me until 4:30 to get to my house. Cubes studded the road as I went. The faces I saw were dead-looking in appearance, but filled with raw emotion. Some showed nothing at all. I wondered if some of the bodies simply died after being subplanted, or if suicides were simply thrown in with the rest while the situation was taken under control. My house was as I left it, except that the front door was wide open. The garage stood open and empty, the blackness within uninviting. I heard scuffling feet in the distance and inched closer to my house. Despite the effort of getting here, I was afraid to approach my home. It was that feeling of visiting a place where memories seem to be held for you for safekeeping. The smells and look of things once familiar pulling you back with irresistible force. Sometimes those are good experiences, reliving those memories. But in that moment, I was afraid of what it would do to me. The scuffling got louder, and I looked over my shoulder down the street. There seemed to be movements in the shadows, but I wasn't sure. My eyes were swimming with tears, and I steeled myself and marched through the front door and directly into the living room. It was dark and cold. The undeniable fragrance of home invaded my nostrils, and I felt myself relax. It was still creepy, but it was familiar. Lynn was gone. She must have run through the front door and left it open. I looked at the mug of tea I had been nursing that night, spilled on its side on the floor. Going through the kitchen, the kettle sat cold and silent on the burner on the stove. My mom's charging cord dangling against the cabinet. Standing there with my hand resting on the counter, I heard a grave intake of breath somewhere in the house. I froze and felt the icy fear ripple down my arms and into my stomach. I quietly crept to a drawer in the kitchen and took out a large mag light my dad bought years ago. Testing that it still worked, I snapped it on and off again and moved into the back of the house. The carpet muffled my footsteps as I walked, listening to the small noises coming from my mom's bedroom. All thoughts of collecting small things I had made a note to retrieve from my room and the rest of the house were lost. I rounded the corner to my parents' bedroom and looked in. On the bed was a figure, back facing me. I saw the chest expand and shrink. The small wheezing cut through the air. My hands were sweaty and shaking. I lifted the flashlight and turned it on. The circle of light was dazzling in the darkness, reflecting off the second porch door that connected the room. The figure, in navy capris and red and white striped top, froze. Mom? It was what she had been wearing that night. I inched closer. The figure remained frozen. Mom? I asked again, my voice cracking. In the light, she slowly turned her head to look over her shoulder at me. I gasped and almost dropped the light as I saw her hollowed-out face and watery red-rimmed eyes. A dry breath, and then... Mel? It was the same voice I heard that night. This realization helped me move more confidently over to the figure. Stepping to the other side of the bed, I saw, clutched in her hands, an old family photo of the three of us my mom had framed. Daddy? My eyes were dry, but emotion was in my voice. Mel. Mel. Oh, Mel. A hand reached out weakly to mine. It was my mom's voice, but my dad was evident inside of it. I knew it was him. Have you been here this whole time? I wanted to sit on the bed next to him, but I couldn't. Not just yet. This is no way to be, Bub. No way at all. Your mother... I could see a small tear leak from his right eye. We're both gone now. Only somehow I'm here. I'm so confused and so scared. His hand gripped the photograph more tightly. But it sure is good to see you again, kiddo. He smiled a dry smile, and I sat on the bed next to him. The suddenness of my father's passing 6 years ago was completely upending. For months, my mother and I struggled to get through our daily lives. We managed well enough financially, but the small life we were building lost one of the 3 primary pillars of support. I've since made peace with it, but still had dreams about him coming to see me, asking about my life. In those dreams, he was always proud of me. And I'd wake up, missing him so much, I couldn't catch my breath. And I'd wish to see him again, to really talk to him. But looking at this pitiful figure, the true shadow of the man I knew, feeling the hard loss of my mother, I couldn't help but take that wish back. Dad, oh God, is it really you? Yes, I don't know how this happened. Everything is so sharp and hard-edged now. The sounds are so loud, lights are so bright. I'm confused. He repeated quietly to himself. Something happened, and then I felt some magnetic pull. He took a deep, rattling breath. And then I was here, in this house. Your mother, then I found the picture after you'd gone. Look how little you were. His fingers touched the glass of the frame. So little. Suddenly, a shout cut through the air. The harsh sounds of footsteps broke through the house, and I heard enraged screaming. The first one through the bedroom door had cuts all over, with bloodied fingertips and cracked lips. He had a maniac grin on his face. 2 women charged in the room and stopped. Their breathing was heavy and somehow empty. They saw my mother lying on the bed, and they saw me sitting there. There was a moment's hesitation as something computed behind their eyes. Then the sliding glass door behind me exploded. Gunfire lit up the room, and a bullet caught the first man on his left cheek. His head pulsed open, and he fell. A man and a woman with glowing eyes advanced through the shattered door. Those devices held in front of them. They hummed violently, and I saw an adult-height haze shield projected from the front of it. The weapon almost looked like a mini containment tower, with a small golf ball-sized sphere on the end. My hair stood on end as they passed me. The remaining 3 supplanted. I can only assume that's what they were now. Tried to run, but they were met by 3 other personnel in black, forcing them towards the first 2, devices held aloft. The man with the gun seemed even more hostile, with fiery, blue-green eyes. He stomped in behind them, and grabbed my father's arm forcefully, and shoved him towards the 3 cornered supplanted on the other side of their bed. The picture fell from his fingers and hit the edge of the nightstand, cracking it. I watched my dad get up slowly from the floor. Jesus Christ. Miss Collis? Eldridge came in from the hallway, eyes glowing. That's my fucking father, you piece of shit! I moved towards the gunslinger. Eldridge caught me by the arm. We've been tracking this last band of subplanet for 2 nights. They seem to have somehow figured out how to work together and hide from our sentries. We think they're the ones who killed Preston and Matheson. This came from one of the women holding a device. Eldridge's eyes swept over the room. He had looked at each of their captives in turn, examining them. A 3rd team is outside, waiting to help move them out to a block. And this is the last of the residents. Move. They started forward, and, carefully keeping the 4 individuals inside the field of their device's resistance, I stepped up quickly to stop them. Eldridge pulled me back and zip-tied my hands in front of me. You goddamn bastard. All these people are no longer a threat. They are not who they once were. Let's go. I started to speak, but he shot me a look, a knowing look, and I fell silent. We were taken by truck back to the center of town. We passed the group that included my dad as we went. I saw them being ushered into an already full block. My dad looked tired and frail as he was pushed in. I looked at my shoes and took deep breaths, trying to contain my raging and conflicting emotions. As we approached, I saw what looked like a fleet of big rigs lined up diagonally on the main road. Their back doors open.
I saw blocks being loaded into their dark, cavernous bellies. 3 to a trailer. The person inside displayed a mix of reactions. I felt sick to my stomach. The writing on the big rig said, Axiom X. The name sounded familiar. It was some kind of company, but it escaped me. We were led to a grouping of trailers stationed in the small parking lot. I was ushered inside one of them by Eldridge and a fireman carrying a guard, and a firearm carrying guard. The guard waited outside, and Eldridge shut the door behind me. He produced a pocket knife and cut the zip tie roughly from my wrists. I saw, sitting on the seats of the trailer's kitchen table, my backpack and the remains of my tent. My laptop sat closed on the table. Eldridge looked at me. He looked tired, and the bags under his eyes were pronounced. You will be taken into custody and moved to a secure facility. You will be given limited access to your cell phone and other devices to maintain the illusion of regularity in your daily life to your friends and relatives. Your computer has yet to be confiscated and replaced with an Axiom X approved device. I suggest you use this time wisely. That knowing look again. Why are you doing this? I don't know what this was in particular. The rounding up of citizens, the leniency towards me. He was about to speak, but a squawked voice came through his radio. Block loading at 85%. Eldridge, you need to get down on 8th and Grand. He looked at me. Right. And he left. I'm sitting here, exhausted, and we're supposedly leaving soon, but these are my experiences so far. I don't know when I'll be able to write again. If I'll have access. I don't know when I'll be able to write again. If I'll have access. I don't know if they want me alive. This all feels so complex and steeped in years of hidden history. It feels unsurmountable. But you are reading my voice, and I will keep it strong and loud for as long as I can. I can't be the only one to bear witness. I hope to update you all soon. Thank you for your concern and replies. The fact that I'm not alone and have your support means the world. I can't answer all the questions, but I will say this. Some of you are right. You suspected and anticipated some of what has happened. Unfortunately, not to the extent that any of us could have dreamed. I'm not sure what to make of the past couple days. Our journey took a day. I wasn't allowed outside throughout the trip, so I never really got my bearings. When we reached our destination, I finally understood where we were. The desert, dry air, an oppressive heat. It had to be Arizona, the closest site to one in Colorado. As I was led outside with Eldridge by guards in gray and red, I saw the large semis being unloaded across the tarmac in the distance. The facility the blocks were being moved into was enormous, but bland. It looked like those buildings you see every other semi docked, where they drop off and receive cargo. I saw noticeably less movement in the blocks as they were transported inside. The compound the facility was on was enormous. The walk to where they held me was somewhat long, so I tried to take it in as much as I could. To the west were 2 large buildings that appeared to be built for holding cargo. This included the one where the blocks were being stored. To the east was an industrial park. Parking lots, 3-story buildings, medians with cacti and red stone. It looked remarkably ordinary. Cars littered the lots. I saw the logo for Axiom X on the walls of these buildings. To the north was desert, bleak and empty. The south was the same except for the black vein of road cutting through it. The whole compound was fenced in. The poles of the fence were thicker than your average fence pole, and they were topped with brass globes. I was taken to a large, flat, 1-story building. Air conditioners chugged quietly in a line along the wall. Once inside, I realized these were living quarters. The guards stopped inside the doors, and I saw sweat beading their foreheads. I had to go through a security checkpoint where my phone and computer were taken. Eldridge beckoned me to follow him down a series of hallways.
and showed me to room 250. It wasn't anything impressive. A single bed, a desk, sparse bathroom, and a dresser. No TV, but there was a stiff and scratchy armchair in the corner if I had the urge to sit back and read for a while. Could you explain to me what's going on? I dropped my bags and sat on the bed. I felt sticky, with the sheen of sweat covering my skin. I hadn't changed my clothes since Friday. Eldridge made sure the door was closed and turned to me. You technically broke into a government quarantine, interacted closely with individuals inside the quarantine. This, he gestured to the room, is more than others would have gotten. I tried to contain my scoff. Is this because I made it out that night untouched? Is that what this is? Because if it is, you know why. My dad warned me in time somehow. There's nothing special about me other than I was lucky enough to get to a car in time. I realize that. But there are others that see potential in you. He paused for a moment. Back in the early 90s, there was a lack of congressional funding to the Ed, which resulted in a substantial amount of contractual work with Oxium. The technological advances Oxium made were leaps and bounds beyond what government scientists were producing. The committees involved in the Ed were happy to hear this. Over time, more control was given to the company, and by 1999, all 5 facilities were running with Oxium-created equipment and staffed largely by Oxium scientists and staff. Congress and the governmental side of the Ed still have a hand in things, but Oxium-backed congressmen and women have slowly begun to become more prominent in those committees. The operation of the Ed has slowly come more into the control of Oxium. The government is still extremely tight-lipped about everything, but I haven't heard of anyone's hackles rising because of this shift in the power dynamic. He stopped to rub his eyes. Maybe it was decided by the powers that be, but this is too much of a liability for the government to handle, or that it's not worth the time and money any longer. What I'm trying to tell you is that you're of great interest to Oxium now, regardless of what I report to them or the government. What happens next is largely out of my hands now. I felt hot, waxy fear drip down my back. I couldn't stop it from happening. A wash of self-pity came over me. I wondered how the hell this had all happened. I'd lost so much in such a short time. It would have been hard to describe, but I imagine it's similar to what people might feel when natural disasters strike. You lose your home, sometimes your families, your pets, your assets, everything. You're left with what you had on your back. Life experiences and intelligence may account for something, but the sheer emptiness of the loss of your physical life is beyond my ability to describe. Sitting in that dingy motel-like room drove it all home clearly to me. I had no home, and I felt as if I wasn't even regarded as a person any longer, but more a pawn in the overall scheme of things. As if I had some special abilities, some special immunity that they could tease out of me. I know the trope of the sinister corporation is tired, but what Eldridge described to me about the shift in control over the Ed really upset me. So I'm to sit here and wait on them until they're ready with whatever they have to test me or something? I didn't choose any of this. I was lucky enough that my father somehow came to me. Now, here I am, days later, waiting on the whims of people who know nothing about me except the truths I've told you, yet they don't want to believe what I've said. I can't stay here. You can't leave. He stood up straight. You can't leave the compound. They won't let you. Even if you did leave, the fence I saw you eyeing means protection. Being outside of it is dangerous. His phone buzzed. I have to go, he said suddenly. You'll be issued a laptop soon. I think you'll find a notebook and your pen in your bag. Don't stop recording and don't stop writing. He pulled a small bag from his back pocket. It was black nylon and pill-shaped, roughly the size of his palm. Eldridge placed it on the bureau. Your access card is on the outside porch. 2 of the scientists, Parsons and Chambry, have asked that you report to Facility 1 at 9:30 tomorrow morning. I advise you to make it a priority to get there. He unzipped the pouch and produced a contact lens case. Before you go, put these in your eyes. Oxium developed them. They allow you to see the manifestations. They react with the heat in your eyes and bend the light to such an extent that you can see where manifestations are at any given time. Don't keep them in too long, though. 2 hours max is pushing it. For what it's worth, I'm sorry you're here. I never expected this turn of events. Maybe I did on some level. I could have kept you out of Glenwood when we saw you approaching. This story is just too important. Then why not write it yourself? You're using me to get this bullshit out in the open. I have trouble swallowing your supposed altruism when I'm the one living this and telling others about it. Eldred's face grew red at that. I have to live with myself and my past. Bigger things are in motion at this point. My credibility is compromised by my association with this. Your voice is pure and untouched. So yes, I am using it. I'm not asking you to overlook that. Be disgusted with me. I'd welcome it. I'd be shocked if you weren't. Once you get there, you'll see the extent of things. He turned and left abruptly. I didn't look at the contacts or the access card. I laid on the bed and looked at the ceiling. My body and mind were tired. I wanted to shower, but felt too exhausted to move. After a few minutes, I fell asleep. In my dream, I was laying in bed, just as I was when I drifted off to sleep. The lights were off, and the silence was so complete my ears felt like they were ringing. There was a weight on my bed, other than my own. To my right, facing the wall, was a dark figure with its back towards me. It was still, but in the same position my dad was when I had found him in the bedroom at Glenwood. I didn't move, and I barely breathed. The figure started to slowly roll towards the tight space between the bed and the wall, and I knew a full rotation would reveal its face. Although I wanted to shut my eyes, I couldn't. It fell suddenly into the tight space. I didn't see its face. My dream self had no reaction. Then I saw two long-fingered hands, smoky and black, grip the edge of the bed and began to pull it towards the ground. My side of the bed tilted up as the hands pulled down. A head began to rise above the edge of the comforter. It was shorter than a human head and charcoal gray. It only had a mouth that was open and possibly wide. My body began to give into the gravity and slide down the bed. Suddenly the bed was the size of a parking lot, and I was the size of an ant. The open mouth was huge. An empty, gaping maw. I fell towards the mouth. As my body rolled over the hot, steaming gums, I jerked violently in my sleep. I woke up suddenly, then in a panic, crawling off the bed frantically. I backed up against the window. It was dark out, except for the lights illuminating the outside parking lot. I breathed heavily as I stared at the space between the bed and the wall. Eventually I got the nerve to check the space, and there was nothing. I left the lights on the whole night while I wrote. I'm gonna stop here. I'll post more soon.
I slept only a few hours after that dream and was woken up by a knock at the door around 8:30 a.m. on Tuesday. When I opened it, I found a laptop bag with a computer inside of it sitting there. I didn't use it until I ended up in Albuquerque, where I am now. I got ready for my meeting, or appointment, or whatever you want to call it, and felt a bit better having showered and washed my hair. And the contacts sat waiting for me. I'm lucky enough to have almost 20/20 vision, so I didn't have to swap any prescription lenses for these. They were thick and awkward when I put them in. I had to blink away the tears as I adjusted to the new sensation. When I opened my eyes, things looked how they normally did, just a bit sharper. Have you ever worn polarized lenses? There's something about them that sort of mutes the brightness of the world while sharpening the edges and colors of what you see. These lenses did that. I wasn't surprised to see then that the Arizona sun didn't bother my eyes as much as it normally would have. When I left the residential building, I glanced around to the compound as I walked and found myself looking into the expanse of the desert. I thought I saw gray-white blurs in the distance, but they were too far to make out. The haze of heat rising from the desert earth obstructed any chance I had of seeing into the distance with clarity. I quickly forgot what I thought I saw once I got to Facility 1, and security escort came to me, eyes literally glowing. We made small talk. She was friendly, but I had a sense that she was working off a loose script. We whispered through hallways where I saw laboratory space, offices, social areas, and storage rooms. The air was chilled, and I felt goosebumps on my arms. The route through the building was windy, and it felt as though she was told to take the long way around to get to Parsons and Chambery. We entered a side set of stairs, climbed past the second floor, and exited onto the third. Pushing through a door at the end of the hallway, we walked onto a dangling metal bridge. The catwalk crossed over what was probably one of the largest and most vast sections of the building.
Hanging from the ceiling were large, flat bronze discs, and stretched along the walls were containment pillars. I took this all in a matter of seconds, but before I even looked down, the sound was what hit me first. There were hundreds of people down on the floor. Almost all were yelling, some weakly, some loudly, some were crying and arguing through sobs. These interactions were sometimes occurring with a partner, sometimes alone. It was a symphony of the dead. Bunks were scattered around, and what I could tell were once orderly rows. I could see temporary toilets against the walls, and intervals behind the privacy curtains. Everything was in disarray. Everyone looked emaciated and sick. The clothes were dirty and tattered. Many were simply sprawled out on the floor or their beds. But with my new eyes, I saw more. I saw gray, white figures, opaque and hazy, as if seen through the snow on a washed-out TV screen. Some were tall, others were squat and fat. Some figures had the proportions of a normal adult human, only with slightly larger mouths or 2 long legs. I could see that these figures were lingering around the body to which they were attached. It was as if these people had died and yet their ghosts were still tethered to their physical bodies, although only I knew that wasn't what had happened. The shadows were making grotesque faces contorted in grimaces of pain or sorrow, anger or hate, of fear. I saw their mouths moving, talking quickly, but heard no sound come from their transparent throats. Some had their mouths open in what looked like a terrified scream. The figures were all distorted in some macabre manner. All of them looked to be in some type of pain, somewhere. In the rational part of my brain, I wondered if they had always looked like this, or if they had been twisted over time. The people to whom they were attached appeared to mimic the shadows, somehow translating and vocalizing those emotions in one form or another. Worst were those who had no shadow hovering over their bodies. They were just people. Glenwood residents, swept up with the rest of the supplanted. Solitary children, a few men and some women, all by themselves and isolated from one another. My escort didn't notice I had stopped some 10 feet back when she turned. Are these? I couldn't get the words out. My eyes searched frantically among the bodies for my father. She didn't answer, and instead asked me to follow her. When we got to Dr. Parsons' sparse office space, I realized I had no recollection of the rest of our short journey beyond the catwalk. My mind was racing. Dr. Parsons and Dr. Chambry both looked like normal people. They could have been parents of the friends of mine. They wore lanyards around their necks with access cards attached and contacts in their eyes. I sat down. They introduced themselves. Dr. Jerry Parsons, Dr. Janice Chambry, and offered me something to drink. I declined. Then they began to run through the history of the ad. You know most of it. I do too. Not worth repeating. Dr. Chambry shifted subjects. You must be wondering about what you saw the other night, and probably what you saw before coming here into this office. My hands were shaking with anger and fright. I looked at him to answer, but before I could respond, Dr. Parsons cut me off. Oxium has begun experimentation and testing on the supplantation process, more accurately on how to deliberately supplant someone, how to then forgive the term, exercise that manifestation, returning the individual to their original state. They explained further that tests over the past 2 years were unsuccessful. Those individuals were lost causes. My phrase. Who knows what was done with them? The events of Glenwood were indeed unfortunate, they said, but not without their silver lining. We were lucky enough to save these individuals, the ones you saw a little earlier. We brought them here, and what we hope to achieve is to reverse the supplantation process. I finally got to speak. And you're doing this to rescue those lost during the events, to bring them back. It was hard to keep the disbelief from my voice. Well, yes, Dr. Chambry replied, but as part of our ongoing research endeavors, if we can reverse this process, then we're one step closer to actively supplanting someone safely with a manifestation of our own choosing, then remove them with no harm done to the host.
Host. I sat back and felt the loose threads of what they were getting back, trying to connect. You want to actively supplant a person, then push that shadow back out and replace it with the original person. Am I getting that right? Parsons. Yes. Chambry began to speak, but I cut her off. To what end? I mean, you've seen what happens. The types of manifestations that come back, the type of people they become. Chambry sat silently for a moment. Parsons looked at her. In your statement, you mentioned that your father came to you, she said, slowly, carefully. Further, you came into contact with him again later the next day. I hope I'm not being insensitive, but what was that experience like for you? I opened and closed my mouth. The threads were alive with electricity, but I answered. It was painful and sad. I've missed him. Of course I have, but it felt all wrong. It was him, but not him. They seem to ignore that statement. That is the end we hope to achieve, Miss Collis, Parsons said. Imagine being able to speak with your loved ones from years past. What would you say? What they would say? His eyes glittered. You, Miss Collis, are the control of this experiment. Those individuals you saw, the ones from Glenwood, provide the best chance we have at unraveling this mystery. You will act as a counterbalance of sorts throughout the process. The threads connected with a jolt. I couldn't believe the errant and utter disgust for these people, no more than I could believe how I was to be the control of their experiment. We are on the edge of a scientific breakthrough, so monumental it defies full comprehension. The existential implications alone are staggering. We are close, Miss Collis. So very close. Come with us. I stayed sitting. The escort came from the hallway outside and pulled me up by my arm. Chambry and Parsons had apparently lost patience with my incredulity and half-heated defiance to their work. I shot my arm roughly from her grip. Despite what you may think, or have been told, Chambry said, looking into my face, you are not a visitor here. We're scheduled to perform a test in 15 minutes. You will come and watch. The false niceties of the first half of our meeting, such as they were over. They told me my place in this, and I was supposed to respect it. That was why they were so candid with me. Probably they never expected me to leave. What's the harm in sharing the details of their work? I had no fight in me, though. But more than that, I knew I had no plan of escape. I would have to wait. We walked through a series of corridors to an elevator where we rode down to SB2, as sub-basement 2. The doors opened to a room with a cavernous ceiling. It was enormous and circular in space. On the far side was the real-life versions of the hastily drawn sketch Eldridge had given me. The pillars stood tall, firm, and imposing, and one of those bronze discs hung over them, covering the full circumference of the circle pillar form. On the floor were 5 smooth, pie-sliced shaped stones, making a circle. Set in each was a smooth crystal, about 20 inches across. Sitting in the center was a man, in a ruffled suit, tired and haggard. His eyes were wide, looking at the apparatus around him and the individuals outside of it. My contact showed me the shadow of an old woman, hunched over the man's body. She was spinning on the spot, taking in her surroundings. She looked afraid and was crying silent tears. I knew that Parsons and Chambry could see her too. We all could. Walking to a control panel set up on the platform, some 40 feet away from the pillars, Chambry said, "We have tests scheduled every hour and a half across all of our facilities. Of course, they are working on separate pieces of the research, although none are as interesting as ours." She smiled at me. I stood on the platform as the lights were dimmed and the pillars were powered up. Other control stations were set up around the room, and operators with headsets were confirming the sequence of activation to one another. I watched as the humming became stronger, and a light on each control station turned green, which presumably gave others the go-ahead to begin their part in the sequence. When all ancillary stations are green, the operators of the one I was on punched buttons and pulled levers. The humming was oppressive. Between the pillars, the heat haze that I saw in Glenwood rose up. Only this time, I saw starlight dance along the haze. The smell of ozone permeated the air, and I watched as the operators worked. The hum was audible and present in my eardrums. Inside the circle, I saw 5 smooth crystals begin to glow. The man in the center cried out. The old woman began sobbing. The haze was so thick now, it looked as though they were underwater. She tried to clutch at the man, but her hands found no purchase. She was on all fours, breathing heavily, but I saw him trembling. He looked up at the platform, and I saw blood coming from his nostrils and from his left ear. His eyes were red, and the veins in his neck stood out. The old woman started to dissolve. I could see the frantic look on her face as she began to fade. The man rose up on his knees, arms wrapped around his stomach. He looked as though he was going to be sick. Then suddenly the right side of his chest crushed in with a sickening squelch. The top left side of his head collapsed into a skull after that. He coughed one smattering of blood onto the stone and fell forward. The old woman's mouth was open, and she suddenly and violently dissolved, as if blown apart by a sudden forceful wind. The humming began to lessen and slow. For an instant, as I watched, I saw a large shadow pass over the sparkling haze of the containment field. A shadow as tall as the pillars themselves. It lingered for a span of 3 seconds, then was gone. I don't know if the others saw it, but I assume they must have. My dream suddenly came back to me in that moment. Like the first failed flick of a Bic lighter, the spark of that memory was gone in an instant. Parsons sighed disgustedly and pulled a contact lens from his back pocket. He removed the contact lens from his eyes and blinked moisture back into them. Another one. Maybe the tension of the field was applied too quickly. Chambry looked at him. Perhaps. She was silent and turned from him. Her eyes on the gore splattered in the circle. I was led away after that. No further explanation. Chambry and Parsons didn't appear to notice I'd left. I went back to my room, took out my contacts. Numbly, I wrote down all I could. I'm done transcribing this for now. The events of the rest of the day were uneventful and aren't worth telling. I feel sick by what I saw. And as I think about it now, by what I would eventually see, I'll report more tomorrow if I can. But know this, I'm away from that facility. What happened there appears to be happening elsewhere. If that's the case, and I'm right, this has gone far beyond my own experience. If you dream like I dreamed, then you've had your warning. There's no emergency alert system for this other than that dream. Get out and don't look back. For now, I'm going to rest.